I've always been the kind of woman who gives everything of herself, no matter how hard it gets. When Daniel's illness took hold, I didn't hesitate for a second. Every day turned into a marathon of hospital visits and endless waiting rooms, of whispered prayers and those fleeting moments of hope that felt like sand slipping through my fingers. I never let myself stop, not even when the nights seemed to stretch on forever. I found my strength in the quiet moments, in the soft rhythm of his breathing and the brief flashes of clarity in his eyes. I knew he was slipping away, but I couldn't let go of the promise I made to be there for him, no matter how it ended. I would sit by his bedside, holding his hand like it was the only thing keeping me anchored to the world. The sterile smell of antiseptic clung to me, and the cold light of the hospital lamps turned every moment into something stark and unyielding. I watched him fade, day by day, my own heart breaking in ways I didn't know were possible. But still, I stayed, because I needed him to feel loved, even in his final hours. When Daniel's time finally came, it felt like the whole world just stopped. That final goodbye was a whisper in the dark, a tearful promise that I would find a way to keep going. In the days that followed, I felt like I was moving through a fog, heavy and suffocating. Friends tried to comfort me, but nothing could fill the emptiness that had settled deep into my bones. I let myself feel every bit of the heartbreak, refusing to pretend that I was okay. But even in those quiet, aching moments, I held on to one small truth. Our love was real, at least for me. It was fragile, but it was enough to steady my shaking hands as I braced myself for everything that would come next. I found myself lost in the mundane tasks that suddenly became monumental. There were death certificates to sign, funeral arrangements to make, and so many little details that seemed impossibly important in those first days. Each signature felt like a final nail in the coffin of the life I had known. My hands would shake, and my mind would drift back to moments when Daniel was still here, laughing with me, holding me close. But each time I picked up a pen, I reminded myself that this was how I honored him, by seeing it all through, no matter how much it hurt. It was the last thing I could do for the man I loved. At night, when the world went quiet, the weight of it all would crash over me. I'd lie in bed, the emptiness of the space beside me a cruel reminder of what I had lost. The sheets were cold, the house felt too big, and the silence was deafening. I'd close my eyes and remember the feel of his hand in mine, the sound of his voice telling me everything would be okay. I wanted to believe those words, even though he was gone. In those moments, I felt both completely alone, and yet, in a strange way, still connected to him. I tried to find comfort in the memories, the small, tender moments we shared that no one else would ever understand. The way he used to brush the hair from my face when I was tired, the way he'd wink at me across a crowded room. Those memories were all I had left, and they became my lifeline. They were proof that, despite everything, there was a time when it was just us, and that time was real. I held on to that truth like a secret, even as the rest of the world kept moving forward. And in those memories, I found the faintest glimmer of hope, a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to start again. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself forced to face a mountain of paperwork, documents that felt cold and impersonal, yet were all that was left of the life we had built together. Each folder, each signature, was a harsh reminder that he was really gone. I'd sit at the dining table for hours, papers spread out around me like a fortress I didn't know how to conquer. Some days I wanted to set them all on fire, to let the ashes carry away my pain. But I knew that wouldn't bring him back, so I kept going, page by page, because I had to. The house was filled with echoes of the past, his cologne lingering on the pillow, the faint smell of the coffee he used to brew in the morning. I'd catch glimpses of him in the smallest details, a jacket draped over a chair, a note in his handwriting that still smelled faintly of his cologne. And every time, my heart would twist in my chest, a bittersweet ache I wasn't sure I'd ever fully heal from. But I couldn't let myself drown in the memories. I had to find a way to keep moving, even if it meant letting go of the pieces of him that still felt so close. Somewhere in the middle of all that paperwork, I started to believe that by sorting through it, I'd find a way to honor his memory, to close that chapter of our lives and start a new one for myself. I thought that once I had everything in order, I'd finally be able to breathe again. It felt like the last promise I could keep to him, to take care of the things he left behind, to find peace in the wreckage. But deep down, I didn't know that those papers held more than just signatures and numbers. They held secrets I wasn't ready to see, and as I turned the last page, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet sense that nothing would ever be the same again. I thought handling the paperwork would be a step toward healing, a way to find closure and maybe even a sense of peace. Each morning, I'd pour myself a cup of coffee and sit at the kitchen table, determined to get through it all. The stacks of medical bills, life insurance forms, and property deeds felt endless, but I told myself that every page was another piece of the puzzle I needed to solve. It was exhausting work, a different kind of exhaustion than caring for Daniel, but no less heavy on my heart. I believed that if I could just get everything in order, I could finally start to breathe again. There was something comforting in the routine of it, even when it felt overwhelming. I'd spend hours reading through old statements and receipts, my mind wandering back to the life we had shared. The vacations we took, the house we built together. Those memories felt like small lifelines, reminders that there had been joy and laughter once. I held onto those memories tightly, letting them soften the hard edges of the paperwork in front of me. It was a strange mix of grief and nostalgia, each document another reminder of everything we had lost. Sometimes I'd find myself pausing to run my fingers over the worn edges of an envelope, imagining Daniel's hands there before mine. Those little details, his signature scrawled across the bottom of a page, a note scribbled in the margin, felt like ghosts of a life that was no longer mine. I tried to hold on to those fleeting connections, even though they hurt. It was in those quiet moments that I realized just how much of myself I had wrapped up in him, and how hard it would be to let that go. One evening, after another long day of sorting through files, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a name I didn't recognize, written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting on a legal document. My heart started pounding as I read the page over and over, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it had to be a mistake, a name I didn't remember, someone I'd never heard of. But the more I read, the clearer it became. This was no stranger. This was someone who didn't belong in the story I thought I knew. I sat there in the dim light of the kitchen, the paper trembling in my hands. I could feel the air leave the room, replaced by a suffocating sense of betrayal I couldn't ignore. It was like the ground shifted beneath me, and for a moment I couldn't tell which way was up. My thoughts spiraled. Who was this woman, and why was her name attached to things that were supposed to be ours? I felt the sting of tears at the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back. I needed to stay clear-headed to figure out what this meant. Every instinct in me wanted to believe there was an explanation, some innocent reason for her name to be there. But deep down, a part of me already knew the truth. I could feel it like a stone in my chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. The name was attached to assets I thought belonged to us both, the house we had built, the life we had shared. I sat there, numb, as the realization began to settle in. And in that silence, I understood that everything I thought I knew about my marriage was about to unravel. I kept reading, even though every word felt like a blade. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer, but I knew I had to keep going. The details were there in black and white, dates, signatures, property deeds with that woman's name on them. My stomach twisted with each line, but I forced myself to see it through. There was no going back to not knowing, no way to pretend this wasn't real. I took a deep breath and kept reading, because I needed to know how deep the betrayal went. The next morning, I woke up with the documents still spread across the kitchen table. I stared at them in the cold light of day, trying to find some piece of hope in the mess. But the truth was there, clear and undeniable, no matter how much I wanted to look away. I felt like a stranger in my own life, like the woman I used to be had been stripped away in the span of a single night. My heart was heavy, but I knew I couldn't let myself get lost in the pain. I needed to understand why this had happened, even if it broke me in the process. I told myself that managing these affairs would help me find closure, but now it felt like opening a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The house we built, the life we created, all of it was tangled up in these documents, and in the name of a woman I didn't know. I realized that the truth wouldn't bring peace. It would only bring more questions, more hurt. But I couldn't turn away, not now. I had to keep going, to see this through to the end. And in that quiet moment, I felt something shift inside me, a determination to uncover everything he had tried to keep hidden. I spent days piecing it all together, combing through every page and every signature like a detective in my own life. The more I read, the more the truth came into focus. A truth that felt like it had been waiting in the shadows all along. Daniel hadn't just hidden things from me, he'd built an entire world with someone else. I felt like I was living in a stranger's home, surrounded by lies I never saw coming. My hands would tremble as I flipped through the papers, but I couldn't stop. I had to know it all, no matter how much it hurt. I discovered that Daniel had transferred everything we owned into another woman's name, Emily. The house, the car, the savings, all of it was hers now, like I had never existed. At first, I wanted to believe it was a mistake or some kind of misunderstanding. But the evidence was there, line after line, signature after signature, and it was impossible to deny. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever known. I had given everything to him, and he had given everything we built to someone else. I felt like my entire marriage was crumbling in front of me, every memory suddenly tainted by this revelation. The woman's name echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that I was nothing more than a chapter he had closed before he died. I tried to remember the man I thought I knew, the one who held me through long nights, the one who promised me forever. But now, all I could see was the man who lied to me until the very end. And in that cold light, I realized I didn't even know who he really was. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her name in my mind, like a stain I couldn't scrub away. Emily, a name that meant nothing to me, yet had somehow become the center of my life without me even knowing. I felt like I was drowning in questions. Who was she to him? When did it start? Why didn't I ever see the truth in his eyes? My heart twisted every time I thought about how many times I had told him I loved him, how many times I had believed he loved me back. All of it felt hollow now, like an echo in an empty room. I found myself going back to the smallest details, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. I thought about the nights he came home late, the phone calls he'd take in another room, the moments when he seemed distant and I didn't understand why. Those little things I had brushed aside, the excuses I had made, they all came flooding back in a sickening wave. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him why he did this to me, but he was gone. And the silence he left behind was almost worse than the betrayal itself. But even in the middle of that anger and heartbreak, a part of me still wanted to believe there was a reason, some explanation that would make sense of the mess he left me in. I clung to that tiny spark of hope, like it was the last piece of my sanity. Maybe it was easier to believe there was a reason than to accept that he had simply chosen someone else. But deep down, I knew the truth was simpler and harder to bear. He had lied to me, and in doing so, he had taken everything I thought I was worth and handed it to someone else. I sat with that truth for days, letting it settle into my bones until it felt like part of me. The grief was sharp and constant, but it was the anger that kept me from falling apart completely. I thought about how I had given him every piece of myself, how I had stayed up night after night to make sure he wasn't alone, and all the while, he had been planning a future with someone else. It was a betrayal that went beyond the heart. It cut right into my soul, leaving a wound I didn't know how to heal. Some nights I would stand in the doorway of our bedroom, staring at the place where he used to sleep. I'd whisper into the darkness, asking him if it was all a lie, if I had just been a convenient distraction while he built a life with her. But the only answer was the quiet hum of the house, the walls that seemed to hold his secrets long after he was gone. And in that silence, I started to feel a new kind of strength rising up inside me. It was fragile at first, but it was there, the determination to uncover the rest of his lies, no matter how much it hurt. Because I knew now that this wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about me, about the woman I had been and the woman I was going to become. I realized that I couldn't let his betrayal define me, couldn't let it be the last chapter of my story. And as I closed the last folder of documents that night, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. I didn't know what the next chapter would hold, but I knew I was going to find out. And in that quiet promise to myself, I felt the faintest spark of hope begin to glow. The next step was to meet with a lawyer, though I had no idea what I was hoping to hear. I sat in his office, hands clasped tightly in my lap, feeling like a child waiting for bad news. The lawyer's voice was calm and measured, but his words cut through me all the same. Daniel's decisions were final, he explained. There was nothing left for me to fight for. I wanted to argue, to scream that it wasn't fair, but the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, nodding, my heart sinking with every sentence. Walking out of that office, I felt like I was in someone else's life. The city outside seemed to move at a different speed, everyone else in motion while I stood still. I tried to make sense of it all, but the truth was simple and cruel. I was left with nothing. No home, no security, no answers. It was as if everything I had built with Daniel had been swept away, and I was left to pick up the pieces alone. But even as the weight of it all pressed down on me, I refused to let it break me. I reached out to Emily, desperate for some kind of explanation, or maybe even an apology. But when I finally got her on the phone, her voice was cold and dismissive. She didn't care about what Daniel had done, didn't feel any guilt for the life she had taken from me. Her indifference was a slap in the face, a reminder that I was on my own now. And in that moment, I realized there was nothing left to say. I couldn't make her see what she had stolen from me, so I hung up and promised myself I wouldn't waste another tear on her. The days that followed felt like a blur of well-meaning voices and sympathetic hugs. My friends and family tried their best to hold me up, to remind me that I was still worthy of love and respect. I appreciated their kindness, even if it couldn't erase the pain or the questions that kept me up at night. They would sit with me over cups of coffee that went cold in our hands, their gentle reassurances weaving a fragile safety net around my heart. In those moments, I started to believe that maybe I wasn't as alone as I felt. But no matter how much support I had, the nights were still the hardest. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing in around me like a weight I couldn't lift. I'd think about how much of my life I had spent caring for Daniel, how much of myself I had poured into a love that turned out to be built on lies. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that everything I thought I knew had been torn apart without warning. But even in that darkness, I could feel a flicker of resolve growing stronger. I told myself that while I couldn't change what Daniel had done, I could choose how to face the future. The betrayal was his burden to carry, not mine. I didn't have to let his choices define who I was or who I would become. I started to realize that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant finding a way to stand in my own truth, even when it hurt. And in that decision, I felt the first real sense of power I'd known since his death. A quiet determination to keep going, no matter what. In the quiet hours, I'd find myself wondering how I was supposed to rebuild a life from the ashes of everything I had lost. It was a question that haunted me every morning when I woke up and every night as I closed my eyes. But I knew deep down that I had to try, because if I didn't, the betrayal would win. It wouldn't just take my home or my memories, it would take me too. And I couldn't let that happen. I was still here, still breathing, and that had to count for something. I started small, focusing on the things I could control, cleaning out the house, putting away the pieces of my old life. Every box I packed felt like shedding another layer of pain, another memory that no longer served me. It was hard, saying goodbye to things that once meant everything. But I reminded myself that those things didn't define me. They were just chapters in a story I was no longer bound to. With each small step, I felt a little bit lighter, a little bit stronger. And while I still didn't know what the future would look like, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Daniel's choices be the end of my story. I had spent so long putting him first, caring for him even as he turned away from me. Now it was time to take care of myself. I could feel that resolve growing with every breath I took, every box I carried out the door. And in that quiet determination, I found a promise to myself that this wasn't the end, just the beginning of something new. Starting over wasn't easy, but it felt like the only choice I had. I sold what little I still owned, using the money to find a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a quiet place with worn wooden floors and sunlight that spilled through the windows in the morning. But it was mine, and that meant more than I could put into words. I'd wake up to the sound of birds outside and let myself breathe in that newness, even if it still felt raw. This was the first step, and I held on to it like a lifeline. I spent my days slowly filling the space with things that were just mine. No reminders of Daniel, no shadows of the past. A second-hand armchair I found at a thrift store, a chipped mug that felt perfect in my hands, little touches that made the space feel like home. I learned to find comfort in the smallest things, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the way the sun warmed my face through the window. It was a far cry from the life I thought I'd have, but it was real. and it was enough. At night, I'd curl up with a blanket and let myself feel whatever I needed to feel. The pain, the relief, the quiet flicker of hope. I stopped trying to outrun the sadness and started to let it wash over me instead. And in those moments of stillness, I realized that moving on wasn't about forgetting what I'd lost. It was about giving myself permission to start again. Each breath felt like a small victory, each sunrise a promise that I was still here, still standing. I joined a support group for women who had been betrayed, hoping to find some kind of understanding in the stories of others. Sitting in that circle, I heard voices that sounded like my own, stories of love and loss, of trust broken, and hearts that refused to stop beating. At first, it felt like exposing a wound that had barely begun to heal. But as the weeks went by, I found a strange kind of comfort in those shared moments of vulnerability. I wasn't alone anymore. There were others who had felt the same ache, the same disbelief. Each meeting, I felt a little bit stronger, a little more sure of who I was becoming. We'd trade stories and laughter, passing tissues and gentle words that carried more weight than I ever expected. In that small room, I found a kind of sisterhood, women who refused to let betrayal be the end of their stories. It was humbling and powerful, a reminder that healing didn't have to happen in isolation. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to feel whole again. Back in my apartment, I'd replay those conversations in my mind, letting the courage of those women seep into my bones. I started to believe that I was more than the pain Daniel left behind, that I was allowed to build something new, even if it looked nothing like the life I had before. It was a slow process, and there were days when I wanted to give up. But I kept reminding myself that healing wasn't a straight line, and that every step forward was worth celebrating. And in that quiet determination, I started to see a future that was all my own. One evening, I stood by the window of my new home and watched the world outside. The glow of streetlights, the distant laughter of neighbors, the hum of life moving forward. I felt a small smile tug at the corners of my lips, a quiet acknowledgement of how far I had come. I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman who lost everything, and I realized she was still here, stronger and wiser. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had softened into something I could carry without letting it weigh me down. In that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. I would no longer let his betrayal define the boundaries of my life. I would find new joys, new dreams, even if they started small. It was a promise to honor the woman who had given so much love, even when it wasn't returned, to build a life that belonged entirely to me. I could almost feel the echo of Daniel's presence fade in that promise, leaving behind nothing but the strength I had found in myself. And in that quiet resolve, I felt the first breath of true freedom. As I stood there, feeling the warmth of the evening air and the steady beat of my own heart, I knew that this was just the beginning. I wasn't who I used to be, but I was still here, and I was still whole. The world stretched out in front of me, open and uncertain, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs and settle the last of the ache in my chest. And in that breath, I found the courage to take the next step, knowing that whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms.